So topic 4, which is about the electrochemistry or electrolysis questions. Electroplating a steel object with a silver involved, the three steps are there. Step 1, coating a copper is applied to the object, then coating of a nickel is applied, and then the coating of a silver is applied. So the coating is done in 3 different parts. How this will work, as you can see, as we are doing the electroplating. So first, the movement of electron in an electrolytic cell from the negative terminal, the electrons will move. The majority of the electrons will be here. The positive terminal of the battery will attract the electrons, so electrons will move out. So most of the positive charge will be left here. Now, what will happen? The electrolyte and the solution both contain the copper ion. So when the copper ions will move towards the cathode, they will gain electron. To balance that, the copper atom will go inside the solution as a copper ion. And the size of this copper electrode will start to decrease. Why? Because the amount of the copper atoms in the electrode is decreasing. So this is also known as the active electrodes. In active electrodes, the size of the electrodes changes. So if an active, you will always have an active electrode if the electrolyte and the electrode are made up, if the anode and the electrolyte are made up of same material or consist of same positive ion. When the copper ion will move there, the copper atom will go inside the solution and turn into copper ion. This is what happened in this electroplating. The chemical process take place on the surface of the object is copper ion gain electron turn into copper atom. Explain whether this process is oxidation or reduction. What is this change if it gain electron? So always remember from oil rig, oxidation is a loss, reduction is a gain. Because it is gaining electron, the copper ion gain electron turn into copper atom. So that's why this change is a reduction. Reduction is a gain, oxidation is a loss. Explain why the concentration of a copper ion in the electrolyte remain constant. So reason for that, like there's a copper ion in the electrolyte and there's a copper electrode is there. So the copper ions will move out from the electrolyte is same as the copper atom enter the electrolyte. So the amount of the copper ion discharge at cathode is same as the amount of the copper atom enter the electrolyte. That's why the concentration does not change. So if one ion leave at the same time, one atom turn into an ion and enter the electrolyte. So the color of this electrolyte won't change as there is no change in the electrolyte. Give 2 changes which we would need in order to coat nickel onto the object in step 2. If I want a nickel plating here, I want to coat this by a nickel. What we should do? So we should change this copper anode with a nickel. And what about the electrolyte? So this electrolyte should also be a nickel. Because the electrolyte should be aqueous salts, not all salts are aqueous. So to be on the same side, as you know, all nitrates are soluble. It will not affect the result. So when copper, what will happen is a nickel, we want a nickel plating. So this electrolyte should be a nickel salt. But best thing, no need to change this steel object will be there. But this electrolyte should be a nickel nitrate. Why a nickel nitrate? Because all nitrates are soluble. So we prefer to use a soluble salt for electrolysis. Copper, nickel, silver are transition elements. State typical properties of the transition element. The typical properties are highly dense and high density and high melting point. Give 3 different properties which are not typical with other metal. What other property? Like typical metals, form color compound, can be used as a catalyst. Variable oxidation states. So can be a good catalyst, variable oxidation, forming colored compounds, or forming ions which are colored as well. You can mention that. Copper 2 sulfate solution was electrolyzed using an apparatus. These are the inert electrode. The last one which we did was an active electrode, but this is inert electrode. A copper, it contained copper sulfate solution means it contains copper ion, it contains sulfate ion, it contains hydrogen ion and hydroxide ion. And we have the electrodes. For a positive ion, we always check, like this is the anode, this one is cathode. We check the reactivity. Copper is less reactive, so copper will move towards the cathode. For negative ion, we check the amount, but sulfate, nitrate, and carbonates never move. Even they are more or less. So we are left with hydroxide. And whenever a hydroxide ion will move there, the equation for a hydroxide ion, that it will give oxygen and it will give two water molecules and plus 4E. So there will always be bubbles of oxygen. So the gas which is given off is oxygen, and the test will be a glowing splint, and the result, it will relight or rekindle. During electrolysis, the electricity passed through a copper 2 sulfate solution. The solid copper 2 sulfate does not conduct electricity. Explain both statement. Means solution can conduct, but solid cannot. So first thing you will mention that copper 2 sulfate solution contain ions. And these ions will move toward their respective electrodes. But why solid cannot conduct? Because copper 2 sulfate, the solid copper 2 sulfate is an ionic compound. And the structure of the ionic compound, it contains a lattice of oppositely charged ions. So ions are not free to move. So the points you will mention that the copper 2 sulfate solution, it contains ions which are free to move. And they move when the electricity passes through it. But in solid copper sulfate, copper 2 sulfate solid, it contains lattice of oppositely charged ions which can only vibrate about the fixed position. Because in a solid, ionic compounds, when they are solid, the ions can only vibrate. But in a solution, the ionic compound, aqueous solution always contain water molecules. So that's why like solutions are there, it means it is dissolved in water. So aqueous solutions always contain water molecules. The electrolysis was repeated using a copper electrode in place of a carbon, and the ionic half equations are shown. Which species reduced during electrolysis and why? This one is a loss of electron. This one is a gain of electron. So which species reduced? Is it copper atom or a copper ion? So copper plus 2 ion. You don't have to mention no, not anode. Reduction always happen at cathode. That is, but the question is which species, like means you have to name the substance. So this is a copper ion gain electron and it turn into copper atom. So this change is a reduction. And here copper atom turn into copper ion by loss of electron, and oxidation is a loss of electron. So which one is reduced? The one which gain electron. So copper ion is being reduced because it gained electron. 1 mark is for mentioning copper 2 ion and 1 mark for mentioning it gained electron. The mass of the copper electrode changes during electrolysis. State how and explain why the mass changes. So what is the reason? Like example, if we are using the active electrodes, we have the copper electrodes, and the electrolyte is a copper sulfate solution, aqueous, copper ion, sulfate ion, hydrogen ion, and hydroxide ion. One is the anode, another one is the cathode. So when the copper ions will move towards the cathode, the copper ions gain electron and turn into copper atom. This changes a reduction. And when these copper atoms are formed, they will stick to the cathode. So the cathode size will increase, or cathode mass will increase. But what will happen as the copper ion move to the cathode, to balance that, the copper atom will go inside the solution as a copper ion. So when copper atom go inside the solution as a copper ion, the equation for this, the copper atom turn into copper ion by loss of electron. So this changes the oxidation, which is a loss of electron, and the amount of the copper ion in here, it will decrease. So if the amount of the copper atom decreases, the size will decrease or the mass will also decrease. So ionic equation, these are the ionic equation, and how you write, you will mention the copper ion move towards cathode, gain electron, turn into copper atom which stick. So the size of the cathode size will increase. And what will happen to the anode size? The size of the anode will decrease. So during active electrolysis, the size will change. But explain why during the electrolysis, the copper 2 sulfate solution does not change a color, because the amount of the ion which leave and the amount of ion which enter is same. If 10 ions leave, at the same time, 10 ions will enter. So the concentration of the copper ions in the solution does not change. And why it does not change? Because the amount of the copper atoms or copper ions which are going out is same as the amount of the copper ions enter the electrolyte. So rate is same. You can mention the rate of discharge is same as rate at which it enter the electrolyte. So this is important electrolysis. You have to learn this.